May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be aligned with your love, O God, our strength, our courage, our freedom, and our joy. Amen. Last night about 11 o'clock, I returned from a brief trip to my hometown of Jessup, Georgia, where yesterday I preached the funeral sermon for Shannon Johnson. Shannon Johnson was murdered in the San Bernardino mass shooting week before last. Shannon and his colleagues were at a staff holiday party when the shooters entered and started killing. Shannon and his colleagues ducked under a table, taking cover. Shannon, 45 years old, handsome, athletic, brave, high school and college football and baseball star, health inspector for the county of Los Angeles, chose to put his colleagues under the center of the table so that he could be on the edge, being their protector. He held Denise Peraza and said, "I got you." And those were his last words. Then he was shot. Shannon's mother and I are cousins. We went to high school together. So I was honored when she called me last Sunday and asked me to go back to my hometown and preach yesterday's service in a Baptist church just 3 blocks from where I grew up. It's a very dark moment in our lives when violent ideology erupts anywhere. If anybody's thinking leads them to divide the human community into us and them, if anybody's thinking leads them to become violent, then that thinking is no longer religious thinking, because religion always connects everything and everyone. It has become ideology. Whether it is a so-called Christian white supremacist who has distorted Christianity into an ideology, or someone who has distorted Islam into an ideology. More about that funeral later. Every year this time, the church asks us to remind ourselves that the light of the world, the baby Jesus, God made flesh, Emmanuel, God with us, came into the world in the darkest of times, not the bright times. It was so then in the Roman Empire occupying Jesus' homeland, and it is so with us today, both in terms of our calendar and also in times of our politics and culture. The nights are now lengthening. We're headed to the longest night of the year. The darkness hovers, yet, as Dr. King said, only in the darkness can you see the stars. I could enumerate the many ways in which our collective lives are struggling with darkness this morning. I'll only mention a few: the mass shootings in Paris, November 13, killing 130 people. Then a mass shooting at the Colorado Planned Parenthood Health Clinic, killing 3 people 2 weeks later, followed 5 days later by the San Bernardino shootings, killing 14 and injuring 21. The fact of the matter is, according to the Washington Post, we have had 353 mass shootings just in calendar year 2015. That is bad enough. What makes this evil is a Congress that fiddles while Rome burns, or while U.S. citizens amass arsenals of military-style weaponry. The United States Congress held hostage by the gun lobby, refuses even to pass legislation that would deny gun sales to those on the no-fly suspect list. Tomorrow is the third year since the Newtown massacre took all those children's lives in their classroom at Sandy Hook Elementary School on December 14, 2012. And since then, the number of gun deaths in America have exceeded 82,033. And if that were not enough, we have so-called leaders who are trying to be elected or nominated by being fear-mongers and hate-mongers. Last night when I was passing through a magazine stand in the Atlanta airport, I saw that this week's Economist magazine has as its cover article a lead called Playing with Fear. And on the cover is a pen and ink drawing of three global leaders. This is not just going on in the United States of America, but three so-called leaders who stir up their voters with fear. France was represented on that cover by far-right National Front leader Marine Le Pen. Hungary is represented by Prime Minister Viktor Orban, and America is represented by Donald Trump. The article reads that Donald Trump called for a total and complete shutdown of America's borders to Muslims. This front runner in the race for the Republican presidential nomination proposed closing mosques and registering American Muslims. We have no choice, he said, totally morally deaf to what this country learned when it refused to accept refugees from Poland and Germany during the Holocaust, sending them back to their deaths. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt imprisoning Japanese Americans during World War II. And in 1988, the entire Congress, not the entire Congress, but a bilateral congressional vote, led and inspired by Ronald Reagan, had a public reckoning saying that that was a moral failure on the part of America to imprison Japanese Americans. We have members here who spent time as children in horse stalls in Santa Ana. The Economist article said that what is very deeply troubling is that what is feeding the polls rising in response to the fear-mongering is this economic and cultural insecurity worldwide. Unemployment in Europe, stagnant wages in America, hurt a cohort of older working-class white men whose jobs are threatened by globalization and technology. And beneath them, they complain, are immigrants and scroungers and refugees who grab benefits, commit crimes, and flout local customs. And above them, overseeing the financial crisis and Europe's stagnation, are the impotent, self-serving elites in Washington and Brussels who never seem to pay for their mistakes. The Economist says, we must engage in new technology, prosperity, and commerce that will do more than xenophobia to banish people's insecurities. The way to overcome resentment is economic growth, not to put up walls. The way to defeat Islamist terrorism is to enlist the help of Muslims, not to treat them as hostile. The main parties need to make that case loudly and convincingly. Thank God last night, 189 nations agreed to a framework to curb greenhouse emissions. But it is only a framework. President Obama warned us. What Bill McKibben called it, it gives us a chance to have a chance of saving the planet, and if we don't work it, we have catastrophe that will start with the poor and come to everyone. And in the face of all that, you and I this morning are called to be joyful. Rejoice in the Lord. I say, always rejoice. Rejoice in the worst of times, because great things are happening. This is a serious call from St. Paul, who wrote most of his letters to his faith communities from prison. He knew he was facing death, and nevertheless he implored us to find a way to rejoice in everything. You see, joy is a choice. It's a defiant joy to which we are called this morning. It is a nevertheless joy, that great Christian word, nevertheless. The kind of joy Paul is advocating is something much deeper than pleasure-oriented happiness. This is a joy that is interior and is sustained even when circumstances are not pleasant. It's a joy that is brought to bear in the darkest of times, in the darkest of periods, in the darkest of hours. Yesterday I was in this Baptist church force field. I heard playing in my heart the soundtrack of my boyhood, which has a lot of bits and pieces, but in the midst of it is this song. This joy that I have, the world didn't give it to me. This joy that I have, the world didn't give it to me. This joy that I have, the world didn't give it to me. The world didn't give it, and the world can't take it away. Let the church say amen. Amen. If you and I are going to say yes to the invitation of this Joy Sunday, pink candle in the Advent wreath Sunday. Every third Sunday of Advent, we light the pink candle, and we are treated to readings about being joyful in the midst of the darkness. If we're going to say yes to this invitation, we're going to have to commit to joy no matter what, which means making a personal, spiritual, internal commitment to forswear anxiety and fear and negativity. Doesn't mean that we live in a denial. Denial is a river in Egypt, you know. We have to have our fears. We have to feel our fears. But we are not to become our fears. We live in a time, let's not be in denial. We live in a time when there is a proliferation of a kind of life that is not fully alive. Thomas Merton said there is so much in the power structures of our life that are programmed for death. It's a pseudo-life that is unacceptable and has no room for real hope. And this death-oriented life goes on pretending superficially to hope, 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 smile, smile, smile always, but it's a false hope, because underneath is the enemy of life, a yawning void of fear, and out of this unutterable voice, Merton says, come the armies, the missiles, the weapons, the bombs, the concentration camps, the race riots, the racist murders, and all the other crimes of mass society. So we are called to leave the city of death, to leave the industries of fear, who make gazillions of dollars saying, be afraid, be very afraid. The gun lobby, the military-industrial complex. We're called to leave that city of death, and those people who are committed to it are not going to be happy when you leave it. They want you to come back and live in the house of fear. But we are called to live in the house of love, to live in proximity to those who are vulnerable, to the stranger, to the scapegoat. As the hymn said, we are to embody God's compassion for each fragile human life. God is with us in our longing to bring healing to the earth while we watch with joy and wonder for the promised Savior's birth. You see that bench over there? That's the Muslim bench. It was given to us by the Muslim Public Affairs Council when 3 years ago they had their annual meeting of all the Muslims in Los Angeles here at All Saints Church. They called us and asked if they could have their annual meeting here, and we took about 2 seconds to say yes, and they filled this room and had their annual meeting. It was one of those great moments in the history of All Saints where we attractively got into trouble. You got all this media because Muslims are our sisters and brothers. Proximity to those who are different is the key. And joy is the byproduct. It is a gift of the Spirit, as John the Baptizer said in this morning's gospel. He had gathered people down at the River Jordan. He was baptizing people in the River Jordan. And he said, this is about an internal change. Don't think just because you got your hair wet that you're okay. That's a ceremonious baptism. I'm talking about a ritual, literal, transformational baptism. So don't just let baptism be an external matter. It needs to shock your psyche so that you can change your behavior. And the people who got it said, well, John, what does that mean? And he said, well, let's start here. If you have two coats, you need to be sharing with the person who has no coat. Now, in the 4th century, there was a bishop, and he was preaching on this very Sunday, the 3rd Sunday of Advent, same readings, same word from John the Baptist. If you've got two coats, give one of them to somebody who has no coat. Then that bishop went on to say, y'all go home and look in your closets. Those extra coats you have, those are sin coats. They're dripping with sin, and you can transform them to be compassion coats. So we started this little tradition here at All Saints Church about 9 years ago, that on this Sunday, once every 3 years, we would just ask everybody to go home this week, look at your closets. If you got all those coats you're not wearing, they are cold people in Los Angeles on the streets. So we want you to bring your coats. Now, don't you be bringing any ratty coats. We don't know. The way we put it, we want you to bring your gently used and in good condition jackets, coats, heavy sweatshirts, and sweaters, and you can drop them off in the church office, or there'll be red boxes here when you come to church next 2 Sundays. And we'll do it through December 27. And these we've already connected with the Pasadena Unified School District. They have a Families in Transition program, and the Los Angeles Catholic Worker. And all you have to do is bring your coats and be compassionate for every fragile expression of life. And then the core piece for the recipe of joy is to put the love at the center of your life and let it organize all the disparate parts of your life. The more that we can put together, the more that we can include, and the more joy we will have, Richard Rohr says. But the more we need to reject and oppose and deny and exclude and eliminate, the more open you and I are to negative and destructive voices and to our own worst instincts. Greg Boyle likes to remind us that the problem that we have in our lives is that we have forgotten that we belong to one another. Would you move out of the house of fear into the house of love? That will remind you that we do belong to one another, that we are one another, that we are not separate from one another. One of the most joyful moments that Thomas Merton ever had when he was walking down the street in Louisville, Kentucky at the corner of 4th and Walnut, and all of a sudden had an epiphany that absolutely everybody on the street was his brother or sister, and they were they were him, however the grammar is on that, and that what he had been taught in the monastery was a delusion, that we are separate from one another and that monks are better than people who are not monks. No, he said, we are all one. Every one of us has the light of God shining in us. Every one of us has the energy of love shining in us. He says, if we could just get in touch with that, we could put an end to war, We could put an end to violence. We could put an end to bigotry. He says the only problem we would have is we wouldn't get anything done because we'd all be genuflecting in front of one another. My cousin Shannon Johnson had moved into the house of love. His father died when he was 8. He died trying to rescue a colleague who was drowning in a toxic pool. Shannon's daddy, age 29, filled his lungs with oxygen, ran down the ladder, tried to pick up the man who was 210 pounds. He was only 180. Couldn't do it, went back up, took another gasp of oxygen, went down, knew what to do, grabbed the 210-pound man, and they both fell to their death. On his tombstone, read John 15:13, "No greater love has someone than to give his life for a friend." And that's exactly how Shannon died, giving his life for a friend. So he had a tattoo program, and on his body, he, with meticulous care, was getting tattooed all the different disparate parts of his life that he was bringing together and integrating in the house of love, organizing everything that is. He had meticulously, carefully put all on his walls in his apartment, all of the framed photographs of all the different members of his family who had been fractured as a result of this traumatizing experience when his father was 29 and he was 8. He was trying to integrate absolutely everything. And so on one shoulder, he had a tattoo of his first wife and then his second wife and then the woman he was engaged to be married to. He had his mother, his 2 grandmothers, his father, his brother, all the people in his life who were having difficulty with one another. He had them tattooed all over. His entire back was covered with this giant Lady of Guadalupe. He loved Los Angeles. He loved South Georgia. He wanted to bring them together. He was very playful. He had a tattoo of Vivian Leigh on one shoulder with a sombrero on. He'd love to say, "Lord, have mercy." So he's having "Lord, have mercy" and "Dios ten piedad de nosotros" on. He was integrating all the disparate parts of his life. And his house of love energy just absolutely broke out yesterday in the Baptist church. So afterwards, we had a family gathering for lunch in the fellowship hall. We had fried chicken, otherwise known as the gospel bird. We had funeral potatoes, no better potato casserole. Lots of wonderful food. 2 of the 3 tattoo artists who had spent so much intimate time and so many, many thousands of hours tattooing his body carefully and respectfully, with whom he had had intimate conversations. 2 guys from East LA, Mauricio and Eric. They were there. Denise Peraza, the woman whose life he saved, was there. All of his former wives were there. House of Love was integrating us all. And at one point, my 92-year-old Aunt Carabeth and my 89-year-old Aunt Laurie said, "We want to meet Mauricio and Eric." So I said, "Come on over." So here I introduced South Georgia to East LA. They got up and hugged one another. My aunts wanted a picture taken with them. Then my cousin Almarie, she came over. She said, "I want to meet Eric and Mauricio." Took a picture and she said to Mauricio, she says, "I don't have a tattoo." Mauricio said, "Not yet." When we live in the house of love, we can leap over every boundary. From the inside out, Plutarch says that whatever you do inside is going to have an impact on the outside. You and I can help bring the human race into the human family by living in the house of love and in the midst of darkness, being instruments of joy. Amen.